Hello, I'm Tom, an assistant producer in the world of telly, and for as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with knowing how TV is made, thanks to shows like Doctor Who Confidential and all the behind-the-scenes features on DVDs. One of my biggest passions is helping to make TV more accessible to those starting out in the industry, as for me, it seemed like a big, scary world that was impossible to get into. Getting into TV aims to break down those barriers and deep dive into every single role that we can, from unscripted to scripted. Join me in each episode where I'll talk to a different TV professional about what they do, how they got there, what tips and tricks they can give you, plus some general TV chat. In this episode, I'm speaking to Scott Dewey, who is the head of development at Thomas TV, which is a production company, an independent production company here in Cardiff. And he's just going to talk to me a bit about his role and how exactly he got there from going from a runner to head of development, and just give me the tips and tricks that he can about working in development, as well as also touching a bit about on how to look after your mental health whilst working in the TV industry. This is Getting Into TV. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining me today. I think what would be great is to actually start off learning a bit about you, a bit about your career. So if you could just tell me a bit about what it is you do, a few of the shows maybe that you've helped develop or something like that, that would be really good.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, Tom. My name is Scott Dewey. I'm currently the head of development at a Cardiff production company called Thomas TV. I was always wanted to work in TV kind of starting out, but I didn't know anyone trying to get into it from the start, and went to university and really struggled to then find a job in television and get my first step on the ladder. Eventually found my way in, and yes, initially started working on production, so researcher, AP on all sorts of things, then moved over into the world of development, which I've kind of been doing for the past 5 to 7 years now, developing shows like Secrets of the Aquarium, which is on BBC iPlayer at the moment.
I've been meaning to watch that. It is actually on my playlist. I had it there this morning. I love all them kind of shows like Secret Life of Chester Zoo and all that kind of stuff. So that is on my list to watch.
It's nice heartwarming television. I'm obviously very biased, but it's nice heartwarming television. But so I've done that. I've developed Retro Electro Workshop, which is on yesterday. Mylene Class, Miscarriage and Me, which is probably one of the things I'm most proud of. The BBC Three series Paranormal, The Girl, the Ghost, and the Gravestone.
Proper mix of stuff then.
Yeah, I like to. That's one of the things I love about development, is that you get to do a real variety of things. One day I'm looking at really specialist factual things, getting all into science and engineering. The next thing I'm looking at, what's hot on TikTok right now, or what's on Aldi's middle aisle. And I think the joy of that for me is, from my mind, keeps me very creative and going off in all different directions. Those are a few things that I've worked on, and being head of development or development producer, the jobs are very sort of similar. So I kind of oversee a slate of ideas, and as head of development, your main job role is keeping everything ticking really, and working with the owners and creative directors on your slate. So slate is just a fancy word for a list of ideas and what we're doing. We just call it slate for whatever reason.
It sounds cooler, doesn't it, than a
It
to-do
does
list.
sound cooler than my to-do list. Yeah, you're not wrong. Kind of talking to them about kind of the strategy, about what our company is good at and our identity and where the opportunities might be, and kind of having at my level, kind of more about the strategy and the opportunities that are out there, and then come up with ideas that will fit that and how you kind of sell them, because you're not just selling the idea, you're selling your company as well in many ways.
It sounds like such an interesting process. I've not really done much development myself, but I have worked in an office where development's been going on. In my current role, we're doing a tiny bit of development, so I'm kind of learning a little bit as I go. But I'm really interested to talk to you, and it's just that world that I don't really know much about, so I'm really excited to chat. But there was one thing before I got a list of questions here, but there was one thing I really wanted to ask you from what you just said, is that you went to university, and when you struggled to find work, how did you find, because personally, I feel like when you go to university, there's so much pressure to get a job straight away. How did that make you feel, knowing that you spent 3 years going to university to do what you love, but you didn't get that job straight away? How did you cope with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, really good question, and it's something I found very tough to deal with because I did, by the letter of the law, I did everything right. I was a goody two shoes. I wasn't a massive partier. I got all my essays and things in before time. I studied. I was one of the top in my class. I did student radio. I did student newspaper. In my summers, I did work experience. I even got the odd bit of paid runner work here or there during my sort of degree. So then come out and then have done like everything, you get told when you're going up, work hard and it will all sort of pay off. And to then not be able to get anywhere was just, yeah, it was really devastating. And I nearly gave up. I ended up on job seekers at one point just to sort of, keep it going and taking whatever I could.
I did the
And
same. It was a
I applied for, yeah, it's so difficult to get in, and when you don't know anyone about what you're doing right or wrong. And I went for all the graduate schemes, the BBC and Channel 4 and stuff like that, and I would always get to the assessment stage but never any further. And one of them, I remember, it's really stuck with me as a horrible memory. It was in London. I had to go out for this assessment day, so I saved up and paid for a train ticket, went up the night before, managed to stay on a friend's sofa, and they did this X Factor style elimination thing halfway through the day where they
what
read out,
for like a job interview?
yeah, for this
Oh
this
my
training
God.
and read out a list of names and asked you to go into the other room where they told you that they were cutting you halfway through the day.
Oh
And I
wow.
didn't make the cut. So I was stuck in London, I'd paid all this money for a train ticket and just got cut halfway through there. And so I had to hang around and wait for my train home, which I paid for a cheap one later. And I just remember ringing my mum up on the phone and, breaking down in tears and saying, maybe TV isn't for me. And we were talking about, what else could I do from it? So it was really, really difficult. And from what I understand, there was very little that I was doing wrong. I think a lot of it is just so competitive to
Mm,
kind of get into. And, as I'm sure other people have spoken about, there is a degree of nepotism sometimes in
yeah.
our industry in terms of who you know. So not having any kind of contacts or anyone to put in a good word for me wasn't great. And yeah, so I nearly gave up, and I'm determined now to try and, and this is why I think what you're doing is so great with this is
Thank you.
help people get that sort of advice or first step, because we could be losing so many amazing people and amazing ideas from all sorts of different backgrounds for something that's really a stupid
It's
reason,
so
really.
true. Like, and I think definitely when you're talking about development, that you want people from you don't want all the same kind of people. You like I in one of my previous podcasts, I was talking to a guy called Jack, and he had a stammer, and we were just talking a bit about the fact that in telly you don't want everyone to have like that kind of posh BBC voice that they all had in like the 50s and 60s. You don't want that. You want people from all walks of life to get that development. But I can't
Exactly.
believe that they did that X Factor kind of style thing for you. Like that's
No, I
brutal.
know. I've mentioned it now to a few people at that broadcaster. I won't name them, and they said they've changed the way it's done that now, which I'm really glad about, because that is just really cruel when
For
you
an
spent all
industry that's already so
them all
hard.
that way.
Yeah.
But no, I mean you're totally right as well in terms of like I often think this about personality types as well as in when we talk about kind of diversity, and I think
Mm.
particularly with development and TV, we do have a lot of really kind of extroverted, loud, kind of certain type of people, and there's a certain type of person that stereotypically people might sort of gravitate towards. And then people like me, I'm actually quite introverted and have to like really push myself to be that
Yeah.
sort of person. I was listening to your podcast with Alexia and just admiring her about the networking sort of
Isn't she
stuff.
so good? Like I was at an event with her the other day, and she just kept talking about the fact that she'd been at an event for 2 days, and I was like, "Stop talking to me because you make me feel really bad." Like she's so good. But
I
no,
have to force
I
myself to
think
do that. So it's yeah, it's great to encourage different people to come in.
it really is. What I'd love to do that now though is go back to the start of your career in TV. Can you just talk to me a little bit about how you started out? I know obviously you went to university and there wasn't that initial struggle to get into telly, but
Hmm.
when did you first get your break? What was that like? Where were there any training opportunities? How did the ball kind of get rolling for you in telly?
So my first job was with a company in Cardiff called Modern Television, and I went for an interview for it and didn't think I'd got it. It was just sort of freely listed on, I think it was the unit list at the time, and I didn't hear anything for ages. So you automatically assume I haven't really got anything. And then about a couple of months later, I heard back and they offered me a sort of a 2 month job, and it was through a scheme called Jobs Growth Wales, which I still think exists now, which is kind of helping. I think they part fund sort of graduates into sort of opportunities. And that was sort of a 2 month job on a ITV travelogue with Griff Rhys Jones going around Wales,
Oh, nice.
which was actually like, it was a really nice gig to get as my sort of first one, and I got to go and stay in all these amazing hotels around Wales. I got to go on the top of the Severn Bridge, and we were filming him like on the wires at there, and you do all these cool things, and kind of wish I'd appreciated it more of the time rather than just stressing out about it.
There is always that stress when you first get a job. I remember one of my first jobs, and it was like I didn't really care what I was working on. It was just like, oh my God, I've got a job, and you just want to impress
Yeah,
people.
exactly. Yeah, and you're so worrying about like not messing up or
Yeah.
doing this, that, or wrong that you don't really just take a minute and be like, wow, look what I'm doing. This is cool.
Yeah.
It's only afterwards when you sort of get that. So that was a 2 month contract sort of initially, and then they had kind of a researcher in the office that did a bit of development and a bit of production, who was moving on at that time. So I kind of said, if you were looking for anyone, sort of thing like that, I hope you'd keep me in mind. And they said yes, and then I ended up staying there for sort of 2 years. So I turned the contract into 2 years, and doing. I think what really benefited me there was I did a lot of different roles. So I could go out on production. I did a bit of development. I did a bit of officey stuff. Like, I did all the IT and social media stuff because it was such a small company. So I became like quite really important and vital there. And I think that's one of the pieces of advice I've tried to give people that are coming into the industry now is don't be afraid to go work at a small company, because I feel like you can gain a lot of experience very quickly and become really relied on, whereas a lot of the bigger organizations and companies will have people coming in and out all the time, whereas you can get a bit more sort of hands-on experience and responsibility. So yeah, I kind of use that, and then that's how I got my first kind of experience of doing a bit of development and shooting, and then did a few more productions, did some history stuff, did a quiz, kind of a good variety of stuff, and then I used that experience and a similar story to get a 3 month contract at the BBC, and then stayed at the BBC for 3 years.
Oh, nice.
Working on like the One Show and Crime Watch and a lot of the things up there. Yeah.
But no, that's it's really interesting that you kind of, I suppose in a way, even though you had all that, I suppose, bad luck at the start with all the uni stuff, you had that real good luck in the fact that you got these jobs and you got these long contracts. Because I mean, from my experience, my experience was I had so many short-term contracts, and I kind of love that in a way, because kind of like you said, they were all at various different companies. I was constantly learning different things, which again, like you say, working obviously at a company for a long time, you get relied upon. But I think what I enjoyed most about hopping around loads of places was just seeing how different companies worked.
Yeah.
I think that's what's really good about our industry. There's various different routes into
Yes.
whatever what you want to do, really. And
Yeah.
especially also, like you say, working on something like a company for a long time, you get to learn about different aspects of within that company and try different things. Because did you always know you wanted to be work in development?
No, not really. I mean, I think it is a really good point you say about you get to learn about the other sides. And I mean, just to say as well, it was never like, here's a 2 year contract. It was always like extended, 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 which is the way it does as well. But I think what it's given me, which I think is particularly helpful now that I don't think you get on a lot of production jobs, is that when you go from production to production, you kind of come in when it starts and then like you leave when it's sort of editing. What I got from that experience of staying at a company longer was I got to be involved with the conversations around marketing and publicity and, the commissioning process. And there's so many other elements and parts of TV that we don't, really know about or we take for granted.
Yeah.
And I got to see a lot about that and how these things get made as well. So it gave me a more well-rounded experience. But in terms of development, yeah, it was something I was always doing. I was, even on productions, I was always someone that was coming up with ideas. I have just always been an ideas person. A boss of mine called me once creatively relentless, which I quite
I
like.
like that. I feel like that should be at the top of your CV.
Yeah.
Just creatively
Um,
relentless.
yeah, and it was like when I was a researcher, someone would give me a brief and I would come back and like, here's 10 ideas. And, they might not all be winners or some of them might have been done before, but that's just kind of always how my mind sort of worked. So when, there was the opportunity to become a development researcher at the BBC,
Mm.
I kind of thought like, oh yeah, that's quite interesting. And I think the more I've grown into it now, I think one of the other things that also appeals to me, again, going back to personality types, is that I think development, you do get a bit longer contracts and have a
Mm.
bit more sort of stability and a bit more sort of a structure, which I think for me as personality is better for me as well.
Um, Keeping with development, like you mentioned, I had Alexia on the podcast a few weeks ago, who is absolutely amazing, and I will keep saying that every time I mention her name. I'm just going to keep saying that she's
Yeah.
amazing. I think anyone listen to this that can hire her, just hire her. She's amazing. But she was talking to me a bit about the development process, from a researcher's perspective. Um, and I was hoping from your perspective of head of development and having worked a lot within the development process, can you talk to me about and how do you come up with the ideas? It's always something I've always wondered, because whenever I mean, for instance, now we are developing a few ideas, and I'm having to find certain parts to go with, like certain cases, basically.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you come up with the initial idea of, oh, this sounds like a cool idea, we're going to go and make it? What is that process like?
I mean, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to describe how it kind of happens, the initial part of it, because everyone has creativity in different ways.
Mm.
You often find that you can sit at the screen sometimes and like, right, I've got to be creative, I've got to come up with an idea for this sort of brief now, but it doesn't always work like that, creativity. And I think the more you can kind of mix it up and do different things, like, some of your best ideas come when you're driving home and you're not thinking about
Mm.
work, or in the shower. And I think there are kind of shortcuts that you can take to sort of find different ideas. Obviously news and real world stories is something that we use an awful lot of, like, a headline or a
Yeah.
statistic as a sort of starting point. Books and sort of options from that as well. I think looking at what's previously been done is always really helpful, even though it might not seem the most creative. But if you look at, a lot of people look through like Radio Times from like 10 years ago to see what was playing on 10, 20 years ago and be like, oh, that was an interesting thing. What would that look like if we did that today?
To a
And I
different.
think a lot of
That's
it
really
is about,
interesting that you kind of look back on previous work. I didn't really consider that before, because whenever I've seen people doing development, they've always had like the newspaper, and like you say, they have the headlines and stuff. But I think
yeah,
that whole idea of going through the Radio Times and seeing what was made 20 years ago and see how you can reinvent it really, and I suppose especially considering viewpoints change as well, it makes a lot of sense.
yeah, exactly. And I think from a commissioner's point of view, when they're very sort of risk adverse and worried about what's going to work and what's not, if you can say, well, a show like this, 10, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
won a BAFTA and did all the sort of ratings, you're on a safer sort of space. And it can seem a bit like it's not that kind of being original and creative, but I think once you see a lot of TV, there is only a lot of things are just variations of each other. But you can also, another thing I think we do a lot is sort of genre sort of mashup.
Mm.
So, you think about what would a natural history program look like on as a E4 reality series, and see how that kind of two worlds coming together. And you get things that come up in sort of a different way. So there are lots of techniques and things you can learn, and looking at newspaper articles. And I think also being really, I think one of the things you have to do in TV, and particularly in development, is be aware of what's working on channels and what isn't at the moment, and being aware of kind of spotting trends. And you might not necessarily see it at first. You might see, oh, I'm seeing a lot of this on TikTok at the moment. Like, oh, what is the reason behind that? And then kind of thinking laterally around that of
Yeah.
how you could then kind of build something into it. And it's definitely a sort of a skill, but that you can sort of work on, and there are kind of shortcuts to help you kind of get there.
Um, in terms of like your team, I've only ever known where I previously worked, it was head of development and a development researcher. What does the development team tend to look like? And also, say I wanted to come to work in TV and I wanted to be a development producer or head of development, how would I get there? What would be the best routes to go?
So I think it's a tricky one. I think a lot of people would say it's good to be in development to also have production experience. So I had experience in production as well. And I think that is quite useful in development because you understand how it works a bit more. Like, you know, I had a junior researcher working for me a little while ago, and we were looking at a travelogue in France, and they came up with all this amazing sort of stuff and came up with sort of episodes of how it could look. But they suggested doing something like in the north of France, and the next sequence was complete south of France. And I was like, well, practically on this sort of budget, when you can be to do that, that's 8-10 hours. And just understanding, you know, and likewise with daytime programs about, you know, you have to be able to film a daytime program in 2 or 3 days because the budget's so small, and knowing those sort of things and how programs are made, I think can be sort of useful. So I think people do move from production and development. So I think that is kind of one route. In terms of sort of team structures, I've been in all sorts really. I think, you know, I've been at really big companies like RDF, which is a Banijay company in 2020, and everyone does it very differently. And I think one of the confusing things with development is a lot of the roles can seem similar.
Yeah.
Like in some ways, I'm still doing some of the same things that a junior researcher would. I'm still pitching ideas. I'm still doing decks and things like that. I think it's more of an evolution. So I think as a researcher, you know, you're doing research and kind of decks, AP and sort of producer hire. You're doing that, but then you're probably also doing access, and maybe you're writing a bit more and pitching a bit more. And then when you kind of get into producer and development exec sort of level, you're doing all that, but then you're probably adding a bit more sort of strategy and actually developing relationships with talent and commissioners. So you're kind of building on them bit by bit, really. But I think if you were just starting out and you were looking at what skills do I need to be in development as like a sort of an entry level job, then I think stuff like, you know, being technical point of view of Photoshop and Premiere and sort of those packages, you know, we're increasingly selling ideas that are, you know, it has to look really glossy, and you're selling them a tone and a style as much as you are the words. And I think when I first started, treatments were very much 3 pictures at the top of a page and, you know, some writing, and they would just be page to page writing. But now, as I'm sure you've seen, they're glossy, you know, brochures, and then you've got sizzles and tapes as well. And I think if you're starting out, those are really good skills to know how to be able to edit and Photoshop and do the sort of technical side of it, because I think, you know, a lot of other people wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. So I think that that's from a technical point of view. And I think one of the great things is that you can learn a lot of that just on YouTube and stuff like that. I've never done any courses on those sort of things. I've taught myself through it.
Pick it up yourself, and it kind of. I feel like that's like you say, it definitely does help. On one of my last jobs, like nothing to do with development, but I was initially doing the casting, and then my series producer found out I could edit, and I ended up doing all the casting tapes for the entire series. But it was just giving me that level of responsibility, in which I'd never done casting tapes before, so it was really good to kind of be given that thing that I could own and kind of learn how to create a story within like 3 minutes and really sell this person. Which was really interesting. On the topic though of treatments and sizzles, do you mind, for someone that's basically never got into telly, do you mind just explaining a bit about what they are and the importance of such a thing?
Sure. So you might hear the word treatment. Sometimes it's called a deck, sometimes it's called a proposal, sometimes it's called a pitch. Generally speaking, they're all the same thing. And it's just a written document with pictures in a brochure sort of style that is selling what the program idea that you've kind of got. And they can vary kind of in length and depending on the project of things and as you go along. But generally speaking, you probably start with a couple of pages. You know, you normally have your front page, which will probably be kind of like a mock-up of what the thumbnail on iPlayer might kind of look like, where the idea is now, we used to talk about what people would say is a top line cell, which is just literally a sentence that summarizes the idea in the most neat, precise way possible. And now almost in a way, that first image has to do that same job. You have to know, because that's what viewers are like now on Netflix and streaming. You have to know from the thumbnail what show you're getting.
I'm that kind of person that if I don't like there's a certain show on iPlayer that I really want to watch it, but there's the thumbnail, I don't like it at all, and I can't bring myself to watch it because it just doesn't look that good.
The psychology of thumbnails, I've been looking at this a lot recently, for development as well, is it's so fascinating. Like Netflix have done loads of work on this about, well, in terms of what your eyes sort of look to most and what part of the image. And Netflix, what I didn't realize, have got a customized sort of algorithm so that the thumbnail you see is different from what I see.
Oh, that's
And
strange.
so, yeah, so like the example I've seen is with Pulp Fiction. And so if you like, let's say John Travolta and I like Uma Thurman, my picture will be of Uma Thurman with a certain style, color, font for the words, and yours will be John Travolta. So we're experiencing the same content and they're selling it into different ways depending on our tastes. And I think the thumbnail thing is something that YouTubers have done really well with as well. Like they know the importance of that thumbnail, and sometimes they cheat it and they like put stuff in the thumbnail which isn't in the program.
That always annoys me. Always annoys
Yeah, me
me.
too as well. And we can't do that as program makers, unfortunately. So yeah, that kind of image is increasingly important now. So you'll have that image, you'll have that kind of your cell in the document. So you'll outline kind of what it will be, the structure. So, in episode 1, this, and this might happen. Episode 2, you might talk about kind of the themes of the series, why you think it might work, what series it's similar to. You might include a thing about on-screen talent, who might be the good face for it. Sometimes you include a bit of off-screen talent about, like, particularly with documentaries, they want to know who's the director that's going to make this, who's their vision, what's their vision going to be. And you can often include sort of that side of it. And yeah, it can get, and then if you get funded development and go further down the line, they can be, so I've seen some that go to like 20, 30 pages,
Oh wow.
and you're outlining every individual episode and science behind everything. So that's kind of what, treatment, pitch, proposal, deck, whatever word you kind of want to use to describe it. And then sizzles, again, it's another, we have a lot of funny lingo in TV, don't we? That I think can also be off.
Yeah, and there's so much weird lingo. I mean, again, not really to do with development, but keeping on the topic of, I mean, I work in Crime Watch, so obviously one of the typical lingos we all use is we're going on a shoot, we're going to go and shoot this. But we've become really conscious of the fact that if we say shoot and we're working on Crime Watch, it can be, if we're talking to a certain person, that we should really be careful with what we say. But yeah, there's so much weird lingo out there that, depending on the show, you've really got to think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And you feel like you're stupid for asking, and that you don't sort of know, or that you're missing something. And I think that can be really hard when you're starting out, and it makes it all slightly inaccessible. So yeah, there's sizzle. I mean, the simplest way of saying it is it's a short tape that's selling the idea. But again, there are different terms for, there's a sizzle, there's a taster tape. There's some people use the word rip reel as another one as well, and there's kind of different variations. They're all can be interchanged quite a lot. Some people have a bit of a definition. So a taster tape is probably more of like a chunk of what the program would like. So for Secrets of the Aquarium, we went and shot a taster tape. So we had access to the aquarium, and we went and filmed with some of the characters. And essentially we made like, it's probably too long, but it made like a 10-minute sort of taster tape, which was essentially the opening 10 minutes of what the program would be like, down to music and characters and the pre-titles. So that's kind of a bit more of what a traditional taster tape is like. Then you have a sizzle, which is probably, 2-3 minutes, sometimes maybe as much as 5, which is a bit more kind of glossy and punchy, a bit like a movie trailer. And sometimes they have shot stuff for that, or sometimes you may have not, or it might be a mix of the two. And that's very much kind of like from the producers, boom, brings you, and then like, bits of content that you've ripped from elsewhere to kind of give you the tone of what it's going to be like. And again, kind of selling that in the simplest form possible. But again, just like with the images, that's all about the tone, the music you pick, the clips you pick, all sends a message about what it's going to be. And then a rip reel is a variation of a sizzle, where it's literally all stuff you just kind of ripped completely, and you don't care at all about using other people's sort of stuff. It's more of like, it's like a mood board, which is obviously just like pictures of stuff that you've kind of got an influence, a video version of this is what it could be. So that's kind of what tapes are. And sometimes you can do them yourself if you've got a bit of a development budget, and Sometimes you can get money from channels to then get sort of investment to then go and do that if you've got a bit of initial interest in the idea.
Um, this is just me thinking out loud. Now, obviously, we both work in Wales. Do you
Mm.
find I don't know if working in development, do you have different? Did they basically like the nations and regions have different things that they're looking for? Is it like different for a company? How does that all work? I don't know if they're. I don't know if what I'm asking is correct at all.
Mm.
But I'm just trying to see is if say someone in London wanted to work in development in Cardiff, would they be looking at two different things, or what's that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot, development in the nations and regions and sort of in London as well. I think for a long time, it was mainly development in London because so many of the meetings were like face to face and it was about relationships. But the pandemic and Zoom has actually made that a lot better for us in the nations and regions because you can just hop on a Zoom call, so you're less reliant on going up and down. But there are general, and I think this is one of the things that it's you learn when you get a bit more experience in development is that there you're kind of then linking into sort of skill shortages and expertise sort of around the country as well.
Yeah,
So like, there's certain areas that are kind of known for a certain type of programming. Like for a long time, Cardiff was known as kind of a bit of a daytime hub. We had everything bargain hunt, Crime Watch, the People Remember. It was quite a hub of that. Find It, Fix It, Flog It on Channel 4, and we were kind of known for that. And then you've got to be mindful of that when you're pitching because your company that may have made a premium doc series and your thing is in daytime. So why are the commissioners going to trust you? And that's not to say you shouldn't go and pitch those ideas, but that's where the strategy comes in, where you've kind of got to think about what are we known for and, what are we doing? And then I think obviously you've got nations and regions sort of commissioners who work a lot with their network counterparts, but they do have different priorities. The BBC Wales and S4C commissioners are focused on the Welsh audience. And there are stories that will overlap and ideas that will overlap and could be network things as well. But they will then also be structured in a different way. And, we were talking about sort of language and the lingo, like, you may refer to something like Aberfan here and assume a certain level of knowledge about events that have happened. Whereas maybe at a network level, you'd have to kind of step through it a bit more because not the audience don't know. And yeah, so there's increasing overlap and they're working more towards each other. But it's quite interesting for me. I see sometimes when people come to Wales in development from sort of London, and I think, as you'll know, Wales has a particular culture, a particular sort of history, and a way of doing sort of programs. And if you're not kind of aware that as an outsider, you can kind of look a bit like embarrassing. It's like me going to China and suddenly pitching, I would probably go for the most obvious documentary ideas that have been done there a million times over. So there are nuances kind of around that.
How and really quickly, how do you think? How can people become aware to that? Is it just a fact about research in the production companies that are within a certain area? How can you go about tuning into what's made where, basically?
Yeah, I think it is about, people's websites are obviously really sort of good at that as well. And I think obviously watching the credits of a program and seeing sort of the end boards and then looking at that kind of company and where they're based. I mean, sometimes it is hard to tell. I think it is something you will know from kind of experience. But as a general rule as well, I kind of, even though that has happened where there are different areas that have got specialisms, I don't think that's the best thing as well, because if I want to be a documentary maker coming up in Wales, I don't want to feel like I've got to go to London. You want everywhere to have kind of an equal spread, and I think we're getting better at that. But sometimes I think it's been easier to make some sort of like a center of expertise of sort of area. Like we all know Bristol's natural history, for example. But if you wanted to work on, the next Blue Planet or big blue chip natural history series, and you're in Scotland, you might feel like you might have to move to Bristol, and maybe you don't want to. So,
I suppose in a way, what's really important is if you've got an idea, obviously you may wake up with an idea, you're not going to make it straight away. What's important is, I suppose, is talking to people that you're working with, or maybe even if you're not working in TV, just go into maybe spend some time and work up an idea. And then when you're in telly, just talk to the right people and say, oh, I've got this idea. That I suppose that's a good way of coming up with ideas and maybe one day making what it is you want to do.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, generally speaking, I think people can often be really cagey with an idea and not want to sort of share it. And it's incredibly difficult. And I see it even in pitch meetings with junior members. Like you make yourself quite vulnerable when you suggest an idea and someone else will be like, oh, I don't sort of like that. And we're all often paranoid about someone stealing our idea. And that does happen, but it's a lot rarer than people think. And most people, if you're in the industry and starting out, will cross over and meet people and can suggest people of, oh, you're really interested in special effects and engineering. Well, this company does this sort of show. So maybe you should reach out to them. I know so and so. Let me kind of give you sort of an in there. But yeah, you can do there's an awful lot of research out there now for free when you can sort of target sort of companies, but a lot of companies won't just accept an idea from somebody outside, which can then be tough. It's a lot of it is to do with sort of IP rights, and they want to have all the money for it as well. If it's a massive global success and they don't want you to have any sort of claim to it, or it might just be again they've got their own development teams that are probably coming up with similar stuff. So it's quite hard to just come up with an idea and approach companies, but it can be done.
No, yeah, I think it's just that thing of just keep trying it, and maybe, I suppose really what I'm trying to get at is the fact that to get to work in telly, I think it's just really important to talk to people and just have them conversations with people, and from there you'll get that next step. From there you'll get them chances, really.
Yeah, I think, I like to think good of people, and I think people are generally will try to help. I think it's just knowing about where, I think LinkedIn's a really good example. That's how we sort of connected as well. And I've
It
had quite a
is.
few people that have reached out to me on there that have tried to give advice to, or told them to go to this company or to that company, and tried to help where I can. So I think even just something as simple as that. And you might put out loads of emails, and obviously it's a fine line between badgering people and sending out sort of generic emails to kind of everyone. But actually, if you send something considered, then I think a lot of people will try and help you where you
Really?
can as well. So
No, I
it
completely
is
agree.
a
I mean,
lot
for
to do that.
years, I had no idea what LinkedIn really was for. I just had it because I was told to have it. But
Mm.
recently, I've really started kind of just started to understand it, and it's about connecting with people. And like you say, just make them connections and talk to people and ask the questions, and maybe that will be how you get your break into telly. But also, like you said earlier about having a look at the end credits and seeing who's made what show, what company, that's really important. I mean, even today I sent an email out to a company about a show that I absolutely loved, and just wasn't asking for work. It was just saying I love this, and we like congrats on making it. Like it's something that I've really enjoyed, and I think even
Yeah.
that, not, you don't always need to be asking for something. You can just say I liked this, and that at least they know who you are then.
Yeah, exactly. It's whatever you can do to get on, people's radar, and showing that respect. We've all got egos. Everyone's got an ego. So hearing that I really like that show you did, everyone's gonna, like that. And as you say, it might not lead to a job right away, but if and I think it's just about framing things as well. You don't always have to frame things as if, I'm really interested in getting TV. Can you help me out, sort of thing? Be like, I'd just love to have a coffee with you and find
Yeah.
out the process behind that show. And people love talking about kind of what they did and how they got there as well. And I think that will then open doors as well. Yeah, and one thing I would say, I think that I think is really helpful for people starting out is to just be making content, to just go out and do it. You see now that the BBC are working with TikTok and are inviting TikTok stars to come in and frame them as the next sort of creatives. And I think if just making content and showing people that you're doing that, you learn so much from editing things together. And you might look down at social media and think, oh well, that's not the same as what you do, but storytelling is storytelling. I've got so much admiration for people that have YouTube channels and are putting their own content out, and it might not be the best thing in the world, but you're honing your craft, you're showing your
Yeah.
passion, you're showing your storytelling. And if you get sent a CV and you've got lots of people that are all very sort of talented, and you can see that someone's actively doing something, they're that passionate that they're just going out and making a film just because they think it's interesting, and learning that kind of craft, and doing things and experimenting, I think you're much more likely to get ahead. And I think if that's the advice I would want to hear when I was kind of younger now, is to don't be afraid to just go out and and make stuff and do stuff. You know, I think we're blessed in an age now with phones that you can do such incredible stuff and film
Yeah.
things that look really good, you know, on there, and free editing stuff as well, and just kind of go and learn. Just doing that as a process and having something to show of your work, I think is, you know, it shows you really forward thinking and just really shows your passion again.
No, completely agree with that. I mean, I'm a massive Doctor Who fan. And I think it was 2013, I started a Doctor YouTube channel where I was just making like top 10 lists, or I was making like a fan film and stuff. And it was just, I was just having the best time, just like creating
Yeah.
content for a show I loved and just showing my admiration for it. But
Yeah. I
also,
had a blog doing Doctor Who reviews as well.
oh really?
Yeah.
Nice. But it was just a thing of like understanding how to kind of like talk about telly. That's what I was unknowingly, that's what I was teaching myself, of how to talk about telly and how to make telly and things like that, which I mean, 10 years ago, the thought of doing this kind of conversation I'd have absolutely hated, but I've really kind of developed that skill of talking to people and kind of just not really caring what people think, and just going out and doing it. I think that's really important, is because to work in TV, you don't have to be the most extrovert person, but there is a lot of
Mm.
people skills, and I think that's an important thing. Is like we both said, is just make things and kind of, I suppose, talk to people and get that conversation
Yeah.
going.
And it's a muscle that you have to exercise. The more you
Mm.
do it, as you say, the stronger you get. Like likewise for me, that doing this sort of thing or networking events, like I push myself now, but the more and more you do it, the easier it sort of
Yeah.
gets. And it goes back to that vulnerability again, I think, as well, of putting your own content out there. And it is really hard, you know, and the internet's a tough place, and YouTube trolls and sort of comments as well. But if you want to make stuff, I think going and doing it and living and breathing it and creating stuff yourself, I think being able to show something tangible
Mm.
will always really impress, because there's loads of people go into, you know, studying media like I did, and, you know, film school and making things and doing their films part of their course. So how can you stand out from them? Because there's loads of talented people. If
Mm.
you're doing your own thing beside that as well and showing how much you engage with it, that it's, you know, almost showing that it's a bit more than just kind of a job,
Mm.
and that it's a career, then I think that'll help you along the way.
No, completely agree. Moving away from your job role for a bit, something else that I know that you said you were passionate about, which is mental health, which is something that I feel like, especially since COVID, everyone has become more aware of, but especially within TV. And I think at the minute, mental health and TV, that conversation is right at the forefront of this industry because there's so many people out of work.
Yeah.
Um, what things do you think people interested in career and industry should know about working in telly? I mean, like how hard it can be to get the job. I did a course on Friday, a taster course about mental health, and some of the things we were talking about was the fact that things that make us worry and affects our mental health is the constant look for work and uncertainty of money. But what things do you think people should know and be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tough one. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that there are a lot of good people out there that we're trying to make a change. And I think
Definitely.
that's the really important thing. I think, particularly in the past, I mean, the rates about mental health in our industry are shocking. And I often think, as sort of a development person, if I saw those rates and statistics about people that have thought of committing suicide or suffer with mental health illness, if that was any other industry, I'd be pitching that as a
I mean,
documentary. How is
I
this
read
okay?
something earlier looking at the film and TV charity. It was from their 2019 report, but they've done a recent one in
Yeah,
2021. But they basically found in 2019 that 9 in 10 people working in film, TV, and cinema in the UK had experienced a mental health
yeah.
problem compared to 65% in the population as a whole. And that's like, it's really bad that that doesn't shock me.
Yeah, I know. It is horrible. And I think some people can be dismissive of that, and they kind of say that, well, you're in a creative industry and there's a kind of tendency for people with, you know, mental health problems to gravitate to something creative. You know, it's that idea of the tortured artist that people sort
Mm.
of play up to. But I don't think that is necessarily true. And I think this applies to jobs that are not necessarily just on the creative editorial side, but production management and accounting and all that comes sort of behind it as well. And I think there's a lot that sort of needs to change, needs to be done. So I think if you're coming into the industry, I think obviously the freelance nature of it, I think, is a big part. And I think that seeps into it in a lot of ways. So I think, you know, there is that uncertainty of going from contract to contract, and some people thrive on that and love that, and you can go and experience different things. Some people, if you're like me, that like a bit more stability, absolutely hated that, and not knowing what your next gig is, and it can make it hard to get like a mortgage and all sort of simple stuff like that as well, because you can't guarantee your income. And then I think what then plays into that is because it's so freelance and you're moving around all the time, is that you're so dependent on your previous sort of job and what people sort of say about you as well, which has then created sort of a culture where no one will ever challenge people about bad behavior or do anything, because you're afraid of not getting your next job. You need them to say good things about you, because you won't get your next job otherwise. So it's created a kind of, a culture there. And I think with that plays into that as well, being freelance, a lot of companies don't have a HR department and don't do things in the right way. People will get invited in for a chat about a job. When someone says a chat, it's a soft interview. Then that's what people should sort of know. Don't ever think of someone inviting you in for a chat as like, oh, we're just going to have a nice chat. This is a kind of an interview by stealth is what it is. And that is wrong, really. And it should always be kind of, everyone gets asked the same question so that it's a fair kind of contest. And it should sort of be someone else in the room to make sure it's all appropriate and above board. So I think a lot of those sort of practices that I think are a lot more common in other industries in terms of, HR and how things work and looking after people's welfare and stuff like that, don't often come to the forefront. And I think we're getting better at that. So I think being aware of that and knowing what you can do to sort of prevent that, the film and TV charity are great sort of advice and do a lot of good work with that as well. And, there's Beck too and other organizations out there that will give advice if you're ever in those sort of situations. So I think, you have to know the realities of what you're going into, and that I think at the moment, and I don't know how it can change in terms of being a completely freelance industry. I think in the 80s and a bit before then, I think the staff jobs were a lot more common, but nowadays it is very much a freelance world. And with that comes that uncertainty. I think if you're talking about development in particular, it's I think a psychologist have a field day with me, because I'm dealing with rejection every day, which I hate, and that's basically what I have to do for my job.
How do you that's one of the things I wanted to ask you is, how do you deal with constant rejection? Because it's not normal to because it really isn't. Like, we work in an industry where even like obviously with your job you're getting rejection with what you're doing creatively, but when you're constantly looking for work and say you've maybe applied for 20 jobs and you get 19 rejections, how do you cope with that?
I think it's a really good point. And I think some of my friends that work in other industries, I know like one of them was going to apply for something else, and they're like, oh, I've only really ever had 2 interviews. And I'm like, I've had probably over 100 at this point, and done 100 applications and done all that because of the nature of what we do. So rejection is so common. I think what you have to realize, and it's something I really struggle with as well, is I just have to remind myself that it's not personal. I still take it really hard, or I still don't get a job. I still get upset, even with ideas. If I get something rejected, I still take it personally, and I shouldn't, and that's not very healthy. But I think you've just got to try and remind yourself that just because you've had a rejection and you've had a setback, they're not rejecting you and you as a person. All it means is, for whatever reason, there was someone else that may have had an extra skill. That is, it can be as simple as that. And I think you've just got to, it gets easier as you get a bit older and a bit more experienced in the industry to kind of learn that, and that there will be opportunities, and you've kind of been through that. And I think having that attitude of I'm going to show them is also really helpful. That's what I always do. If someone rejects an idea of mine, then I'm like, well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to go make it for somewhere else, and it's going to be amazing, and it's going to win a BAFTA, and then I'm going to be in myself, secretly like,
and then they can hire you then.
Yeah, exactly. And then they'll all want to work with me, and remember that. But yeah, it is really hard to deal with. I think, again, talking to people about it and being open on about it, we don't want to admit that vulnerability of, I got another rejection today, or someone said no, but we're all experiencing it. And, what's nice now is that I've recently kind of got a network sort of working in development where other people are kind of doing that before. I never used to have that network of people to kind of, rely on. So talk to your peers, talk to other people sort of trying as well and being it together. And some days I'll have a bad day and be like, oh, I can't do this anymore. And people are
Yeah.
you up. And I think having that sort of support network for you, and also I would say having something outside of work to focus on. We can all become too workaholic, and a lot of people say it's only TV, and we do need to remember that we're not surgeons saving someone's life. It's
Yeah.
not the end of the world. And so I think having that good sort of grounding and setting up those boundaries and having something else outside of work that motivates you and keep you going, I think is a healthy thing to have as well.
No, definitely. I'm definitely one of them that is guilty for overworking myself. Or maybe say I have a 3 month contract and then I come to the end and I still don't have anything. I feel so guilty that I can't actually enjoy my time off. But like you say,
Yeah.
it's definitely important to have them things that you can enjoy. One thing I also wanted to say is you kind of mentioned it earlier about going in for chats, and how
Yeah.
it's actually an interview, and it kind of relates to what I wanted to say next is when I first started out in unscripted, one of my first jobs, I applied for one job, didn't get it, and then my CV got found its way into another production as they do, and they asked me in for a chat, and I went in
Yeah.
for the chat. And basically, the questions I was being asked was things like, "Can you drive a van? Can you do this? Are you okay with the kit?" And I was just saying yes, 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 because I was a runner that just wanted a job. And
Mm.
looking back, I think, I mean, it's at that thought of myself in a way because I obviously had to research what the content was. But I also think there's that onus on the production and the people that are interviewing you for to let a runner to understand a runner's perspective, really, of the fact that
Yeah.
when you're starting out, that I was saying yes to these things because I wanted to work. But then 2 days later, when I was actually on the job and I realized, oh God, this is what I'm doing and where I'm still like it was complete. I wasn't prepared for it. And I think that kind of plays into that whole mental health thing because there was this basically I was on in this area where this thing happened, and still to this day it plays in my head. And it's kind of that thing of you want to I feel like more and more people in the industry need to understand that runners will just say yes, or those starting out will just say yes because they want that
Yeah.
job, because there's that uncertainty,
Yeah.
which I feel like gets used for them a little bit.
Yeah, it's people's good nature of,
Yeah.
wanting an extra job and things like that gets taken advantage of. The industry kind of works like that in a way, actually. If
Mm.
you put down, I always compare it to like lawyers. Lawyers bill like per hour. If we were doing that as sort of a job industry, we would come up with these budgets for sort of programs and we're going to say, it's 50K and it will cost this, this, and this. But actually, if you added up all the hours that people do working overtime or going above and beyond, often fueled by that insecurity of not knowing where their next job is, budgets for these programs would be a lot higher.
Yeah.
Kind of the industry is slightly built on that. And then you set a troubling sort of cycle then because you've delivered this amazing program for 50K, but actually it was only made for 50K because you had staff overworking and killing themselves and doing more hours than they should have. And the show should have actually cost 70K to be able to do it in a safe way that doesn't have everyone burning out. And there are certain programs that a lot of people know have a high track record of burning out people because of that very thing. And you feel guilty, and I still do now as well, about like leaving at 6 when my job is at sort of 6, and it's that kind of guilt. And it's interesting actually seeing the generational shift now, because I know a lot of, I think, of Gen Z have very different attitudes towards work. And I was at an employer a while ago and I had junior researchers that left at 6 on the dot, and the MD of the company didn't like that and had words with them about it and kind of made them sort of stay. And I remember being in the middle because I sort of managed them, and I'm like, well, yeah, I stay and I want to show and go above and beyond and work the extra hours. But I'm actually like, you know what? I really admire you for being
Yeah,
strict,
same.
and that's what you're paid for. It's a job. And a lot of people say the stuff about like we're like a family, or a job sort of like a family. And it's not, because a family member can't fire you or let you go and leave you destitute. They would help you no matter what. And I think we take for granted people's generosity and that they will go and above and beyond to be in this industry. So yeah, I think being able to, there's a huge power in being able to say no, and I think we need to as leaders, as we're more sort of senior, set that example and,
Okay.
you know, not be there and encourage people to sort of leave and have a life out work and, you know, as you say, remembering what it's like. And I think also starting out as well, like that attitude of you'll always say yes, and you can get put into difficult situations
Mm.
where you kind of feel like, actually, no, I'm not okay with that, but I've got to say yes because I don't want to be awkward. I remember one of my first jobs, I was having to drive, and they wanted me to drive a car with a cameraman with the boot open. It was like a people carrier sort of thing, and him just sat in the back. And for me, driving it
Wow.
country lanes, well, so he gets the car sort of behind, no harnessing, nothing sort of anything like that. And I was uncomfortable with that because I was like, well, if I brake too hardly and he falls out the van, you know, fine, it might be you and your person and things like that. I'm going to feel guilty and mortified sort of forever. And I remember feeling really uncomfortable having that kind of conversation. And I was made to feel like I was being a bit of a job's worth
Yeah.
and being like, just kind of go and do this. But you know, I felt uncomfortable doing that as a scenario. And I think to your example with the chat as well, is that, you know, I think we have unrealistic expectations sometimes of sort of entry level people coming in. And I think I'm guilty of this as well. I had someone whose CV I was looking at a little while ago. And one of my pieces of advice to them was to sort of tailor it and I think you should tailor your CV and your
Mm.
approach to where you're going, because what I said to them was that if you're going for a job in quiz and you say you want to do quiz and you've got a bit of quiz on there, you've got a bit of specialist factor on things like that, against someone who's like, I 100% want to do quiz, I live and breathe quiz, they're going to go for the person that leaves and breathes
Yeah.
quiz, you know? So, and it's a bit like that when you're going into sort of jobs and the sort of research, like what they want to hear is that you absolutely love the subject that they want. Like, you know, say that job you were doing was like an antiques thing, they want to know that that's what you're doing. But the truth is, as a runner, you just want a job, and actually your love of antiques is not really going to come that much into your actual job description or your kind of a role, really, when you're just driving people around and doing kind of runner jobs.
Yeah.
So I think it's on us to be a bit more sort of realistic about
Definitely.
those sort of things, and also know that people can grow into things and learn things. And just because you've never done it before, you know, I hear a lot of people say, starting out, like, well, how can you want someone with experience for an entry level job, but how can you get experience when you're only looking for people who've got experience in this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy? And I
Mm.
think sometimes we just have to allow time to bring people in, and you know, most of what we can do can be taught on the job if given enough sort of attitude and time. It's not like we need, again, to use the surgeon sort of metaphor, it's not like we need 7 years of training to be able to know how to sort of do a spreadsheet. It's just patience and timing. And I think we have to remember that. I think people get very stressed out, you know, and want everyone to be able to do everything right away and very sort of quickly, and you forget what it was like when you were starting out as well.
Yeah,
So I
it's
think it's
true.
really good to remember that. And I think even just talking about mental health, I think is sort of a huge thing, you know, as well.
Mm.
Even admitting that, like, you know, I'm more open now about that, you know, I've had difficulties with mental health in the past, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really passionate about that. But I never would have said that early on in my career, and I actually felt like I was discriminated for a job once after I did sort of admit that to someone. And then when I went for a job with them sort of in future, I was so prepared for this job. Everyone said I should have got this job. I'm a shoo-in for it. I'd worked on the program before and I should be an absolute shoo-in for it. And I did all this prep about what I would do with the content and what I would do with the role. And then I went in, and all the questions I was asked was, am I up for it? Am I tough enough to sort of handle it? I wasn't asked anything about, you know, the editorial side or what I would do with this. And that was just those sort of conversations about it. And that's where I feel that, you know, I think we've moved on from then now. And I don't think that would be as much, or I'd like to think that's not much of an issue now as well. But I do think there is that kind of question often of being, are you kind of tough enough for it, or can you sort of hack this sort of the pressure of it and only going for those sort of jobs? But in my experience as well, if anything, I've always found that my mental health probably makes me better at my job because I work that much harder.
No, definitely. And I feel like having the conversations, people that have the conversations about it and are more honest and open to their workplace are better at what they do,
Yeah.
just because they, from my experience, they're more open and they're more accepting to the change. that I suppose needs to happen. And places like the film and TV charities, like you mentioned, Back to, and the various Instagram accounts that I follow about TV and the culture, they are doing so much great work to kind of like change it and just have that conversation, which I think is really important. But I got one more question for you.
Right.
Off the topic of mental health, but kind of on the topic of what you want about earlier, is that outside of work, you need something to do. So,
Yeah.
and I imagine we all work in TV, we all watch telly. What are you watching now?
So I mean, I'm a big Doctor Who fan as well, so I watched the first episode, David
Wasn't
Tennant
it really
back.
good?
You just love David Tennant, didn't you? It's really interesting now. I'm so excited to see what Doctor Who looks like with a much bigger budget, with sort of
Oh,
Disney being involved now as well. And it's always famously been underfunded and a little bit sort of cheap, and particularly that the classic Doctor Who was always that
yeah.
was that kind of nature, and to now see it reach the heights that it could be, I think is just yeah, it's really exciting and really good to see that. And then yeah, beyond there, I watched the David Beckham box set on Netflix,
I like that.
which was yeah, it was really interesting. It's it's made by his company, which I always think
I
is
do
quite
think, I mean, personally, I really enjoyed it. I don't like football, but it made me, I was basically sat on the edge of my sofa, actually
mm,
interested in the football. And I was like, I need to
yeah,
know what happens next. And I did find it really interesting. But yeah, like you said, the word I've heard, and I feel best describes it, is in a way is a little bit of propaganda. It is highlighting
yes.
the good things, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because I actually really enjoyed it. I thought what they did was really powerful.
Yeah, I think it is as well. And I think, to get that, I think often that's the way you're only really going to get that access to people of that sort of nature, is they're happy to have a bit of control over it, really. So I think it was insightful. Obviously, certain things were glossed over, and,
Mm.
I don't blame them. Probably if I was in that situation, I wouldn't necessarily want to talk about certain things over others anyway. So I think that's really interesting. What else am I watching? Deepest Breath, I watched. The
Is that the thing on Disney? Is that the guy that the people that basically dive under the water and they go really far?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and hold their breath. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's on Netflix. It's yeah, I mean, very well put together. It's very long, but I mean, it's a really interesting story. One of the things I find really interesting now is watching programs more with my fiance and with my sort of TV head on, of like what I see and what they see. And I don't know if you're like that as well. They're horrible
Yeah.
to watch with, because you just pick stuff apart and
I'm
figure out
exactly the same.
things. But I think like stuff like that I found really interesting. She was like, "Oh, and they shot it all themselves," and then I'm looking at it, I'm like, "No, they didn't."
It's when I
That
watch something that's got
highlights
like
reconstruction that blend well with their archive, but that kind of perception of actually, what most of the audience experience, I always think is really interesting.
yeah, I mean, obviously working on Crime Watch, I do a lot of recon and a lot of interviews and stuff. And I know obviously the process and how long it takes to film and when we film certain things. So whenever I watch something that's got an interview in it, and I'm just like, and I can see that it's kind of in the same room and how many setups there are, and I'm just like, I need to stop thinking
Yeah,
about this kind of stuff and like stop
yeah.
like just watch it and enjoy it, which is really difficult, but
It
I enjoy
is.
it.
It is hard to switch off. Yeah, it is. It is hard to switch off that sort of TV brain of wanting to figure out. I got to the point now. There's been some times where I've kind of recognized like the backing music of a sort of band. I'm like, I've used that piece of music or that kind of effect. Like I always love it more unscripted. I know. Have you heard of the Wilhelm scream?
Maybe I feel like I have.
If you look it up afterwards and you sort of hear about it, it's like it's a sound effect scream of someone sort of falling from like a height that was around in like the 30s or 40s from a sound designer, and it's been used time and time again in films now, and it's kind of done as a bit of sort of a trope among sound editors to keep it going. And once you hear it, you see it in so many films all the time, from Star Wars to drama. You just hear it's this really exaggerated kind of like flailing sort of scream, and you hear that kind of all the time. I always think it's like a fun little Easter egg, but it also then, if you know about it, it kind of then ruins it and takes it out of you.
I feel like
Once you know it, but it comes up in all manner of places. You think like, surely that's not used now, but you'll see it in like modern Indiana Jones films and Marvel, and just sort of hear it in the background. It's very subtle, but it's so distinct that once you kind of hear it, you know,
I'm
it's
gonna hear it tonight, no doubt.
yeah.
I'll watch something. But thank you so much for chatting. It's honestly been really interesting. Just get, I feel like it's obviously been really interesting talking about your job and the development side, and I think that's a really interesting side of TV that I personally have always overlooked. I just because I'm
Mm.
always in the storytelling aspect and I'm always there making it and just head first doing interviews and stuff. But I do the further I've got in my career, the more open I've become to the development side. And I think it's a really
Yeah.
interesting part
And I
of
think
the industry.
Yeah, I mean, someone I was speaking to in development a while ago said that, and I think that's a good point, is that I think development's often been closed off to a lot of people, even within the industry when you're in it. Like it's that kind of room at the end of the corridor, and that's where the development people come up with sort of their ideas. And I think, again, it goes back to that sort of secrecy of, you know, not wanting to sort of share things. And I think it's getting better now as well. But actually, yeah, having people be involved in that process, like I try to, you know, make it and get people in production sort of involved in brainstorms wherever I can, or I have some sort of a prompt up on a board on the side to get people to sort of engage with it and feel like they're part of it, because it is a kind of a unique, you know, some people call it the dark arts, because it's some sort of like mystery sort of thing, but it is, you know, it is its own skill set, and I think having people understand that. And not everyone can do development, not everyone can do production. Some people can do both, but it does require a unique set of skills and certain way of looking at the world. So yeah, I think it is something we should be more open about and encourage people to kind of be around in and bring people in and not be so
Definitely.
closed
And
of ideas.
the final thing I just want to say is I completely agree with that because I feel like the more open I've become to development and seeing how ideas are made, it's made me when I'm thinking about how to start scripting things or how to like how something's going to look in the end. I've really started to kind of like think back to how the original the original idea and things like that. It's just
Yeah.
helped me now how to make my thing more interesting and different, really.
Yeah, exactly. Because often what it's being commissioned on is something really unique, like some new sort of twist, or it's commissioned for this kind of reason. And if you go too far away from that, then it's, you know, sometimes the commissioners get upset or it's not turn out. Sometimes things evolve, sometimes things sort of improve. So I think it's really useful to know that as well. And yeah, just, you know, I've opened a can of worms myself now, and I'm gonna get loads of people coming to me with ideas.
Probably this is probably a good place to end it then.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Scott.
I need to set up a separate email address for people to email ideas.
Thank you so much.
No worries, my pleasure. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. It was so interesting just getting to learn a bit more about the development side of TV. Because like I said, even though I kind of touched in that area myself during my whole career, it's never really been something that I've properly sunk my teeth into. So it's really interesting to understand that process and how they find them ideas, but also getting to talk to them a bit about the mental health side of basically looking after yourself within TV, because it's so vital, it's so important. You're working so many long hours, and you're quite often you're working with people longer than you actually see your own friends and your own family. So you need to obviously make sure that you're looking after yourself. So it was really, really good to hear him talk about that and just give them tips and tricks of how to look after yourself. But if you want to keep up to date with everything Getting Into TV, please do follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Just search Getting Into TV, and make sure to also follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. I've got a brand new episode coming out next week where I'll be chatting to Erin Parsons, who is my friend. I went to uni with her, and she will be talking to me about everything to do with the production office in drama. Honestly, it's a really good chat. We did that one today, and it was I can't wait for you to see that one and we'll listen to that one. But yeah, anyway, I will see you next week for that brand new episode. In the meantime, see you soon. Bye.